appreciate the opportunity to be here today and hope everybody's having a good day so far. I will be talking about token and identity chaining using OAuth 2.0 token exchange, specifically in enterprise environments. So I do have, there's a little bit of information here on a background. So a couple of years ago, we published a couple of profiles to OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect for our, we have a U.S. government sponsor environment that we're looking at. And we're trying to, make sure that the security is up to par, and that we can have interoperability in the environment. So the original profiles enabled identity bridging, essentially by using claims to pass along the user and client in the token, in the access tokens. We had, so we profiled OAuth 2.0, and a lot of the requirements in there were incorporated into OAuth 2.1. And so I've just listed a few of the unique requirements that we have in addition to those in OAuth 2.1. And they're really for the purpose of getting this into an enterprise environment. So for example, each protected resource only trust a single authorization server. And that's really for our the environment that we have. There's a desire for protected resources to only trust their own organization's infrastructure. And as a result as well, it helps avoid mix-up attacks if there's only one authorization server in the organization. A couple of other things is that authorization server has to provide the ability to disable user consent prompt. And that's just, we don't want to overburden the user every time something happens, right? We need to be able to set policies, and we keep audit logs of tokens. Nothing really, all the real security issues have been incorporated into OAuth 2.1, which we are very happy about. Just a little background on what we mean when we say enterprise environment. So these are some assumptions that we're making. The user does not own the data, the enterprise owns it, but the user still has a responsibility to protect that data if it's sensitive data. There is a PKI in place in the environment that we're looking at, where servers and users are issued certificates. I will say users are typically issued certificates. They're not always. Sometimes we're currently looking into other authentication methods beyond certificates, like FIDO, for example. So I want to get through the rest of the stuff. So I'm just going to skip the last two there and get to the problem, token chaining. So the problem is that in some scenarios, an OAuth client will make a request to a first protected resource, which I'm going to call PR1. But that protected resource needs to access a second protected resource, which I'm going to call PR2. And this may continue. PR2 may need to contact PR3 and so on to answer the client's requests. The two cases that we're considering is a single ICAM ecosystem where all the protected resources, PR1, PR2, PR3, and so on, all belong to the same organization and trust the same authorization server. Remember, we require that we're in a single environment. There's a single authorization server. And that's the simple case. The more complicated case is when at least two of the protected resources belong to different organizations and therefore trust different authorization servers. And so that's the one I'm going to spend more time on today. I will spend a little bit of time on the single just to sort of explain what's going on under the hood. And then when we get to the multiple ICAM ecosystem, there will be more details and more intricacies involved. But the solution to both of these problems, is to use token exchange, where for PR1 to access PR2, it acts as an OAuth client, uses token exchange, to exchange the token it was received for one that will be good at PR2. So that's the basic concept of what we're going to dig into here in just a minute. And I'm open to questions. Please stop me at any point along the way if you have any. I don't have any need for you to wait to the end. I will leave some time at the end for discussion, but if you have something pressing, please bring it up. So here's a busy picture, and I'll spend a minute on this just to help make sure everybody understands what the situation is, right? So at the bottom, we've got our runtime system. You know, it's got the authorization server in it and a bunch of other things. So first, the user authenticates and gets a token, and this is sort of out of scope for what I'm talking about today. We're just assuming that, you know, OAuth proceeds as usual. The user gets an access token good for PR1. Well, now PR1 needs to access PR2 to get the data it needs, and so it performs token exchange with the authorization server, sending the token that it received from the client to the authorization server, which returns one which is good for PR2, and that token includes the identities of the user, the client, and PR1 in various claims, as you can see on the very right side of the slide. So the subject is a user, the client ID is I'm sorry. So this box on the right is for the third one. So let me get there. So PR2 needs to access PR3. So now what we do is we chain all the information, the users and the clients and the protected resources all along, and so it gets this nested structure, which contains everyone who is involved in this transaction. You got the user, PR1, PR2, PR3, client. So that's the identity chaining, because we're keeping track of everyone involved in this process. And then the token chaining is, obviously just using token exchange to get to the final protected resource, which actually holds the data that the client requested. And I do want to point out again that in the picture we have the user with a certificate, and that doesn't need to be the case. The user can authenticate in any way that's set up in the infrastructure. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to make these known and available. What's in the token chaining profile that we have developed. So we've got the two initial profiles from a couple of years ago on OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect, and now we're profiling token chaining with token exchange. And so some of the important things that we have here is that we require mutually authenticated TLS. Let's see. The authorization server authenticates all the protected resources in this process because they're acting as OAuth clients. And so when a protected resource performs token exchange, it does authenticate using its PKI certificate, because that was one of the assumptions that we made, is that all servers have certificates. Let's see, what else is important here? The authorization server verifies that the first protected resource, PR1, is authorized to exchange for the requested token. So we're not going to give the details, but that is something that we require. Let's see, the new access token has PR1 as the client and is sender constrained to PR1's PKI certificate. And then the rest of the slide is just explaining that box that was on the right in that diagram. There's an ACT claim that contains nested subject issuer claims and so on, right? So I just wanted to put this up there so that you all are familiar with what we're doing, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because I want to get to the meat of the problem so that we can hopefully get a little bit of discussion going. Oh, yeah. Okay, so as I mentioned, so that was single. In a single ICAM ecosystem, there's one authorization server, and it's fairly straightforward. Where we're running into trouble is with the case of a multiple ICAM ecosystem, where, and it could be the case that maybe two are in one organization and one is in a second organization, but we're just going to assume, because this is where the real problem lies, is when protected resources are in different organization and trust different authorization servers. I do want to point out, because this will become important later, at the bottom, you see this attribute sharing infrastructure. And so, yes, they're in different organizations, they have different authorization servers, but they do have the ability to communicate maybe out of band in some way, or to be configured in some way so that they share information. Right? So like I said, that'll become important here in just a minute. But this is a simple diagram of how token chaining would occur in a multiple ICAM ecosystem. So it's very similar, except that the difference is that you see in step 4, when PR1 exchanges the access token it got, it's going to, so PR1 exchanges the token it received for one that's good at PR2. And it includes the identity chain that I mentioned with all the claims. Okay, so this is the general concept. We have 4 cases that I want to run through. Each of them has their benefits, but I believe that potentially all but one have some significant issues with them that I'm going to bring up at the end. Well, I'll bring up along the way, and then have at the end, I want to present all the issues and see if anybody has any comments or solutions to help us through. I know Brian Campbell did provide some very good input the last time I talked about this, and that's incorporated into these slides, but we're still not to the point of having a resolution, I don't believe. All right, so this is just a pretty picture. It's just to say there are 4 options. We've conveniently called them 1, 2, 3A, and 3B for reasons that will come up in a minute. So I'm just going to walk through these 4 options, and I'm only going to consider the case where protected resource only needs to access protected resource 2, because if PR2 needs to access PR3, then you just PR2 plays the role of PR1, and PR3 plays the role of PR2, and everything works out just fine. So there's only really a need to discuss the situation where there are 2 protected resources involved in different organizations with different authorization servers. But those servers do have an attribute sharing infrastructure in place among them. So the first solution that we came up with, potential solution, is PR1. So this is the example that I started off with, the basic one. User gets an access token, presents it to PR1. PR1 performs token exchange with its authorization server, steps 3 and 4. Authorization server. So I'm going to call the authorization server in PR1's organization AS1, and the authorization server in PR2's organization AS2. So in this example, PR1 performs token exchange with AS1, its authorization server, to get a token, a second token, which is good at PR2. PR2 then has the data, and everything returns back from that point. The pro is something that we're just kind of foreshadowing, I guess. The protected resources in one organization, they don't need to register as a client with the authorization server of other organizations, right? Because it's not dealing with it. It's dealing with its own authorization server, which generates the token good for PR2. So PR1 doesn't need to deal with AS2, and so it doesn't need to register at AS2. And so the cons are, I don't know if they're cons in our situation, but they're potential cons in general, right? Because we do have this attribute sharing infrastructure. Again, I keep pointing this out because I think it helps some of these cons, right? So PR2 needs to trust tokens issued by AS1, right? Token 2, the one that was exchanged or that was received in the exchange, generated by AS1, but needs to be trusted by PR2. So there has to be some trust relationship there. And then the real issue seems to be that when AS2 receives that token in message 6, it needs to be able to verify tokens that were issued by the other authorization server, AS1. And so our solution to this was to use token introspection to have AS2 contact AS1 and perform token introspection in that way to verify the token that was generated by AS1. However, the last con you see is a relatively big one. So it's off-label use, and maybe we can get by with that. However, during the last discussion we had on this, it was pointed out that current introspection implementations do not support this use case. It's not necessarily disallowed. It is off-label, but it's not going to work in current implementations because this was not the intended use of introspection. All right. So any questions before I move on to the next option?
Hey, this is George. I couldn't get off mute fast enough. I guess I'm a little bit surprised at that. So I'd like to hear to some extent, as long as AS2 is effectively a relying party, a known relying party of AS1, it seems like it, I don't understand the off-label aspect of it. Right now, if you're trying to do introspection where there's no authorization between AS2 and AS1, so AS1 can't validate who's asking for the introspection event, then absolutely, I think that there are issues. But if AS2 is a known entity to AS1, right, and effectively AS2 is introspecting AS1's token, then I'm not sure that feels off-label to me.
Well, I like to hear that. It's not necessarily what I've heard from some other people. So the off-label was, that was our thought, simply because it's not the way. It wasn't the intended use by the authors of the token introspection document to use it in this way. I do believe that we can get by with it, right? So you're saying that there is a situation where the implementations would be able to support this as long as AS2 is a relying party of AS1. That's what you're saying, right?
Yes, right. So I think effectively, if there's, if you were using, to go all the way back to the most simplest form from an OAuth 2 perspective, if you were using the client authentication in the in the HTTP authorization basic, right, client authentication mode, right, obviously there are much better ways to do that, but just considering that for the mechanism as the client authentication mechanism into the introspection endpoint for AS1, right, then it's just that AS2 is a known entity to AS1. That still creates some deployment issues, right? If you have a wide ecosystem kind of a model, then getting everybody registered with everybody else's AS can, have its own sort of implications. But I think from the use of introspection to say, is this token valid? As long as the AS2 is a known entity to AS1 and you're meeting the client authorization or client authentication requirements of the introspection endpoint to AS1, that feels exactly like what introspection was built to do, right? It's just that the RP, the entity calling introspection happens to be another AS as opposed to being a protected resource.
That sounds right. Does anyone disagree with that? Because that seemed, I mean, yes, you've got the issue with, being a known entity, right? There is some background, some introduction, there has to be something done before this, right? And depending upon the number of organizations, that may be a little unwieldy. And so it totally depends upon the environment and how many organizations need to communicate with each other. And so, yes, I think that sounds good. Is there anyone who disagrees with this train of thought here?
Oh, makes sense to me. I think that's what Exchange was built for.
Excellent. Love to hear that.
So I don't disagree, but I think perhaps there's two different things that are being discussed. Maybe I do disagree. In step six is an introspection call here as well. And then that effectively expects the unnumbered introspection between the two organizations. Is that?
That was what I read on it too, Brian.
So my sense is that, and I apologize for putting words in people's mouths, but I'm going to try, is that George was talking about if you were to use introspection between AS2 and AS1, and AS2 in that case was known to AS1 as a allowed resource to call it, that would be considered, reasonable or on label use of introspection. But what's happening here in step 6 is PR2 is sending a token issued by PR1 to the AS2, I'm sorry, PR2 is asking AS2 to validate using introspection a token issued by AS1. And that's the point where it becomes off-label, because not many products that I know of anyway support that kind of thing. The expectation is that when you receive an access token at introspection, it is one that you as the authorization server there have issued, and you validate it and return the response. So the off-label problem here isn't so much the use of introspection between the two parties, but the expectation that that would be proxied from the original, or somehow proxied or chained back through to the other introspection call, because that is not kind of in the spirit of how things were intended. So there's I apologize.
No, Brian.
If I can, if I may. Thanks, George. Just to add on, yeah, there are two introspection pieces here. Neither of them is quite what we meant by the introspection spec text, and I tried to bring this up when you guys presented at the OAuth interim too. But also neither of them is specifically wrong. We were careful in the introspection document, or we tried to be anyway, to say that the introspection server had to be able to fulfill the introspection request by about the token. We were careful to not prescribe how that's done, because there are some introspection services which simply unroll the JOT and check the signature and then spit out the bits and hand that back. They're not doing any local lookup or anything like that. It's just an optimization for the RS not to have to do the crypto operations. This is off-label in two ways, in that you are asking AS2 about a token that it didn't issue, but it's totally okay to ask that, because you're asking AS2 about a token that you got, and it's AS2's job to be able to answer that for you at PR2. AS2 is then, I do think it's better to frame it as a proxying case, as opposed to sort of a traditional, resource call. But from the introspection specs perspective, AS2 is acting as a resource calling AS1. And if you have the trust in place and if you have the credentials and all of that other stuff, then that is a reasonable call. What's weird is the chain of trust that's set up between these parties to make this trustable at all. But that's outside of what the mechanics of the spec allows.
Yes.
Yeah, so I just want to follow up on this because to some extent, I believe what we're tackling here is sort of cross-domain federation for OAuth tokens. And we don't really have any official specs for that, right? But that's functionally to me what you're doing. And you know, Justin knows I did this in 2011 with one of AOL's partners, where basically the user would authenticate to the partner directly, get a token, and then present it to one of our services. And we'd then validate that token, going back to the partner's effective AS to do the validation. So, I mean, I think to me, the piece that is sort of, you know, not normal here is the fact that you're describing and, you know, in to some extent codifying this cross-domain federation kind of a mechanism. And I think that's a good thing. I think we ought to have much, you know, much stronger best practice guidance in that space. I don't think there's anything, from my perspective, there isn't anything wrong here. I hear Justin, you know, I agree in the sense of, you know, not maybe being the original intent of the introspection spec, but I think that this kind of a model makes sense if you can deploy it as a way to manage trust, you know, because effectively the trust management is really between AS1 and AS2, right? If AS2 doesn't trust the data coming back from AS1, then it shouldn't issue a new token, right, for PR2. And so you sort of restrict the trust mechanisms into the authorization servers, which I think makes sense, and then allow them to manage the sort of cross-domain bridging that needs to happen.
Yes, so that was our intended use case. You know, there is, I agree with everything, all the weirdness that you guys have pointed out. And this, I don't know that this would be our favorite. So the idea behind these profiles is that they're still in draft stage, and we'd like to reduce the number of options, eliminate some of these. And I don't know that this needs to be, that we want to eliminate this. I don't know that there's a little bit wrong with all four of them. And so at the end, I'd like to see which one has the least wrong with it, right? And this may be it may not, but you know, I'm admitting up front that we don't have a perfect solution here. We're looking for help, and also the feedback that we've gotten on implementations has been very useful. You know, it doesn't matter what's in the spec if there's no implementations doing what we want, then we're out of luck, right? So there's several things going on here. All right, so I see another hand raised. So is that okay? So yeah, okay, so another hand is raised.
Yes, this is Dennis. And well, I have a question. Why don't you implement direct trust relationship? Relying for an RS can trust more than one AS. And if there is a direct trust relationship, then there is no more problem.
A direct trust relationship between whom?
Between the relaying party and the AS from two. Well, if RS can trust more than one AS, then you're done.
Right. So I guess we disallow that, right? You know, each protected resource only trusts its authorization server in its organization. So there are going to be some examples where, you know, the next one, for example, you know, everything is the same as well, let me just go. So, oh my goodness, how do I, there we go. So this is exactly the same as the first one, except instead of PR1 exchanging its token with AS1, and exchange it with AS2, right? And this has a different set of issues, right? And so now this alleviates, how do I get rid of this over here? Okay, so it alleviates some of the problems, right? So, you know, the PR2 only needs to be able to validate tokens issued by its own authorization server, right? Because this time AS2 generates the token that PR2 receives, and so it doesn't have to perform introspection, right? It just proceeds as usual. However, this, you know, we keep running into this problem that we'd like to avoid, where somebody needs to register with every other organization. We'd like to eliminate that because we don't know yet, but there may be some examples where the number of organizations is large, it may be growing, and so that's something we'd like to avoid, but it's not completely necessary to avoid. Right, so here, in order for PR1 to exchange token 1 at AS2, it has to be registered there, right, as a client. So so every protected resource has to be registered at every authorization server in the other organizations it needs to access. Okay, so the second con is shouldn't be there, right? I apologize for that. But so this third con is from Brian Campbell, the last time I gave this talk, where the token exchange URI, you know, needs to be that situation needs to be changed, modified, right? Because when you exchange a token from another domain, the URI is from the domain that issued the token, right? And so I haven't had a chance to work out the details of this. I think it's possible. I think it's likely that all we need to do is define a new URI to solve this problem, right? So token exchange has its own URI, but that's not going to work in this case. And so I just need to think a little bit more about this going forward. So let me pause again and see if there's any more comments, questions on this.
I guess I think that con number 2 is valid. And there's another problem, and Justin hinted at it in his talk, right?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, it is valid. I apologize. I keep thinking it's not, but yes, the second con is valid. I apologize.
And there's one other one I would add in here, which is, and again, this was hinted at by Justin's comments. Many ASs, when they validate their access token, especially if it's about users, right, may go and look to see, hey, has the user logged out? Has the user revoked the refresh token that was associated with this access token? Any number of other things, you know, has the user changed their password since this token was issued? That may basically be reasons to invalidate that. And there's no way for AS2 to be able to do any of those functions, right?
Right.
You know, so,
yeah, oh, sorry, go
so
ahead.
there's a timing element here, right, that becomes potentially problematic. I mean, there's no way to do that for sure, right? So if the risk of the transaction being protected by this token is really high, you probably want to do those extra checks in real time. If the risk is relatively low, then you may be able to say, okay, as long as token 1 was issued by AS1 within the last 2 minutes, right, or the last 30 seconds, then I'll go ahead and assume it's still good, right, in response to C, to PR2 or whatever. But I think that's another con in this model, is you lose, you know, any of the other authorization mechanisms that may be happening with token validation at AS1.
Justin is next.
Yeah, the other part of this that's not shown on this diagram is that there's another introspection call in order to fulfill step 4, whereas in the last diagram, the introspection between AS2 to AS1 is used to fulfill step 6. Here, it's used to fulfill step 4. When the client, when the token exchange happens, the AS needs to validate it, and you would want to validate it. You would want to be able to at least call back to AS1 to allow AS1 to do all of the kinds of checks that George was just talking about, because the knowledge is localized to the domain of AS1 about token 1. Now, there are of course things that you can bake into the token and send it across the wire as a stateless token, but that's, you know, there are massive trade-offs for doing that. Like George was talking about, you can time window things to make it less risky, but then you got to start asking the question, like, am I okay with putting user information inside a token? That could be a huge privacy violation to be chucking somebody's username cross domain, or, you know, a global identifier cross domain. There's just really bad idea in a lot of cases to do that kind of stuff instead of keeping it inside the domain of AS1. Also, this came up in the chat, and I think it bears repeating. In both of these scenarios, AS2 is going to need to know that that token 1 came from AS1. It's going to need to know where to introspect a particular token, which means you're going to have some kind of token structure, which in the wild, I've usually seen that done with JOTS. I have seen one case where they had a token prefix that allowed routing between different systems. That was a weird setup, but something like that can work, where the rest of the token is opaque, and sort of there's a little proprietary mini header that tells you which server to go talk to figure out if the token's still good. You're going to need to be able to do that kind of validation and routing in both of these scenarios, and really any time that you're crossing trust domains here. One of the things that I really don't like about this model personally, though, is that it puts the burden on crossing the boundary on the RS. You know, having an RS know about, let alone deal with multiple ASs is an option for sure, but the best practice tends to be to pull the complexity away from clients and RSs in this space, and to have the AS carry the complexity burden, which is why AS acting as an introspection proxy in the last one, like I said, is weird, and there's a lot of trust issues there, but that's kind of a good place to put the weirdness for that use case, because the AS is carrying that particular burden.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's so I think I think we're okay with some of the things that you just mentioned. For example, you know, putting user information in cross-domain, you know, going cross-domain, that's okay for us. You know, in our situation, you know, the environments that we have set up, at least at this moment, I believe to be okay. The other information, so I will have to think about in terms of, you know, I do agree with you that putting the burden on the AS is better. To be honest, I don't necessarily like this option. It was just one that we're putting in here to get feedback, to see implementations, and so I think we're okay moving on from this one in terms of putting it near the bottom of the list, right? Like I said, there's something wrong with all of these. And so maybe at the end, I'll just go around and see who has, you know, a favorite or a least favorite or something, right? But I appreciate the feedback. So I don't have, is there any more questions? I see there's a lot in the chat. I don't know what's going on in there. Is there anything somebody wants to bring up?
Let's go to 3A and 3B.
Sure. All right. So the three options use a JOT assertion, which was these are intended for across security domains, and so hopefully these will seem a little better. Like I said, there's issues with everything though. So in this case, in step 4, instead of performing a token exchange, PR1 obtains a JOT assertion from its authorization server AS1, which it then uses that to exchange for token 2 at AS2. So this is similar to the previous one. I don't know if I can go back or not. Yeah, so it's similar, except that except for exchanging token 1 for token 2, PR1's getting a JOT assertion that it uses to exchange for token 2. Everything else is, proceeds similarly as the previous example. So in this, so the pros, so token 2 is generated by AS2. So PR2 only needs to deal with tokens issued by its own authorization server. And then, as I mentioned, JOT assertions were intended for this use case. Cons, so okay, there's 4 of them, right? So again, instead of trusting tokens, AS2 has to trust assertions issued by AS1. Additionally, so the second con is more or less handled by this attribute sharing infrastructure. The authorization servers need to agree on the content of the assertions. I don't know how much the third is a real problem. It's just, we have a may, we don't know, right? If this is implemented, there are more back and forths, and I don't know how much that's going to introduce latency. And then this has the same problem as the previous one with the URIs, which I believe we can sort out. So let me pause again and open up and see what people have to say about this one.
Just
anything.
To mention, the URI problem was really just about how the URI that's used to identify the token type in the exchanges, in the regular token exchanges, and there's a URI defined there that says this is an access token, or I want an access token, but the token, that URI is always an access token in the context of the AS that you're talking to. Similar to like introspection, there's the presumption that access tokens are issued by and validated by the AS that created them. So and I don't know if that helps. I'm trying to clarify this a little bit.
Yes, thank you for that.
And I don't know, I can't remember where it came up as a problem in this flow, but it should be less of one because you're.
No, it may not be. That may be a copy and paste error. I apologize. So
no, it may be too, but
it's different.
The piece that goes cross domain here is 5, which is at least designed to do this kind of thing. So that's a benefit.
So is this likable or not to anyone? Not just you, Brian, but anybody.
A couple of things for me. One, it is chatty, and any mobile developer will probably complain. That said, right, I think there is something about obtaining a particular assertion, and provided the AS1 knows about AS2, it could actually create an encrypted assertion, right, which would help in the privacy issues that Justin was talking about, right, in the sense of stuff traversing cross-domain and through PR1 and data. There probably is in many cases some sort of identity, sort of outside of the scope of the flow, identity connection bits that have to, be managed between the ASs. So I think that's potentially another possible positive, but it still has the negatives of option 2, where it's the responsibility of PR1 to know about all of the other cross-domain entities they're talking to and how to get the appropriate target for that other domain, the token for that other domain.
Yeah, right.
So,
Yeah, right. I'm sorry, go ahead. Please continue.
yeah, this is Thorsten speaking. So I personally like that option because the JWT assertion is kind of a standardized format, right? That you can use to convey the data that are relevant between the different domains in contrast to using opaque or whatever kind of structured access tokens that are not intended to be used for that purpose. So that's what I like, because JWT assertions with a well standardized format and content are, I think, the right way to go for that. Yes, it's more complex because you first need to obtain the assertion, but you can make it audience restricted. So the sender is the AS1, audience is AS2, and the convener is the resource solver. Regarding the complexity, I mean, we also assume that the client is able to determine which authorization solver to go to get a token for a certain resource. And to me, that's the same model. I mean, this resource solver just acts as a client, so it's the same model. So I would not assume the AS applies some magic dust here to make it happen. That's just my 2 cents. And I'm stepping back and become the moderator again. George, you should.
Thank you. Thank you for that. All right. Anything else before
George,
I continue?
Your hands is up. Okay.
My apologies. I think the last time I was trying to lower it. So
No problem.
All right, so I'm running short on time here. Let me get the last one out of the way, and then maybe have a couple minutes to talk about, go back and talk about the issues.
David, sorry for interrupting. So David asked the question in chat that
I'm sorry.
I think makes sense to discuss. So does AS1 need to know the JWT assertion is targeted for AS2?
Yes, I do. Well, that's a good question. It should. Yes, I believe it should. And I'm just going to go with that. I haven't thought through the details of that yet, but I will put that on my list of things, good feedback to explore.
I'm gonna just say yes, because the JWT assertion grant has to be audience restricted to AS2. So in order to do that, it's got to know where it's going.
And I would like to add, it might need specific content targeted.
That too.
Yeah. Right. I think, and that was my thought. There may be some really small edge case where you can make it pseudo generic, but I suspect in the majority of cases, you're going to need to know, and you may you may need to actually protect from PR1 the data that's being shared with AS2.
Yes. So yes, audience restricted. That's where I was going, and I think that yes, that is good. So I think that yes, I mean PR1 knows it needs to talk to PR2, and so so AS1 should know that the assertion is going to AS2. All right. Sorry, I was just taking a note there. So in the last 5 minutes or so, so this is another assertion. However, so you have to be careful with the ordering. That's why I have these little numbers beside so in this case, when AS1 receives the token from PR1, the authorization server does the work for the resource, the protected resource. So the AS1 generates the assertion and performs token exchange itself with AS2. So instead of PR1 performing the exchange with the assertion, AS1 does it all. Generates the assertion, performs the exchange, gets token 2, and then returns token 2 back to PR1. Right. So this is in some sense transparent to to the protected resources, but there's a lot more going on with the authorization servers, which honestly we're okay with. I think that we can, the trust relationships, the interactions between the authorization servers, all the concerns that have been brought up today about the relationships between the authorization servers, I think we're okay with. I'm just going to, so a lot of the pros and cons are the same. Just the last con is something that Brian Campbell pointed out, and I put in here just to bring up again, that this doesn't seem to work out, right? Because of what's in the token, right? So in this case, AS1 makes the token exchange call, but PR1 needs to have the certificates there, right? So this is the big issue that I have with this one. What comments do you guys have? If any.
Is it?
Yeah. Sorry.
I don't know.
Take a second to absorb.
Yeah, and thinking off the top of your head is always a very dangerous thing. But I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I'm happy to have feedback later if this is too much for, if it's too complicated to absorb in 3 minutes, right? I'm open for your conversations.
Well, there's a lot smarter people on the call than me, but what I'm wondering is if PR1 is effectively something like a confidential client with its own public-private key pair, or some other thing, and when it goes to obtain token 2, when it goes in step 3 saying I need to validate this one and I need something for this other protected resource, right? In other words, in order to obtain the second token, if the AS1 can validate that PR1 is actually the correct client, right? It does client authentication in that flow. It could potentially stick the fingerprint of PR1's key into the JWT assertion, which then gets it injected into token 2, so that when token 2 presents it to PR2, right, it can present it with a proof that it is in fact the owner of that, public key fingerprint or the public key itself or whatever. So I will let Brian and Justin, who are way better at this than I, tell me I'm smoking something, but it seems like there may be a way to do it, but it would sort of put restrictions on, what kind of client PR1 is.
Yeah, so PR1, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I want what you're smoking, George. That was a joke. No, I think you're exactly right. It's possible to do it, to somehow sort of have AS1 vouch for what the token should be bound to and send that to AS2, and then get AS2 to bind it. But there's more pieces involved. It would need to be described or spec'd out in the option, as well as realizing, I think in that case, that it's probably okay, but you're basically delegating the trust of what that binding is back to AS1 rather than relying on it actually seeing it and doing it at AS2. Yep. Which is probably all right, but it is a factor. And then just the pieces would need to be, so yes, it's possible, but it just needs to be put together and accepted, I guess.
It's not dissimilar from referred token binding, which I also always thought was a dumb idea. It's the kind of thing that is possible, but the level and type of trust that you need between parties is a lot higher to do something like this, because now you need it's exactly the AS1 is claiming that it's acting on behalf of PR1, and you just have to trust that. And there's just kind of no way around that with this model.
Yep.
Correct. Yes.
But depending on what your trust boundaries are and how they work, it might be viable.
Right.
And
yeah, it could be that AS1 is the CA that issues all the certs to PR1 anyway, and so you could do it that way. I mean, there are ways that you could build this that would make it function, but you would be going into territory where you'd have to be very, very careful about what your trust boundaries are and what the how you transverse those boundaries within all of these different steps.
Yes.
Gentlemen, just to remind you, we've got 2 minutes to go.
All right. So this is just a summary of the 4 potential options and the issues. So, and yeah, I certainly appreciate all the feedback that you guys have provided so far. So just as a last 1-minute question, is there any obvious choice or 2 to retain or eliminate at this point from your guys' perspective?
Three felt better because I could understand it a bit better, but that could just be because I didn't understand 4 very well.
I mean, to me, it comes down with all of what you're trying to optimize for. It's true that all of them have downsides, and the downsides are pretty big for all of them, but they're, you know, in terms of like latency or the trust metrics that you need or things like that. So nothing is completely obvious. They're all terrible in different ways.
Yes.
and I think you guys know that. You know.
Yes. No. We absolutely. I'm laughing because it's true.
but at the same time, right, I do think, you know, more best practice for what does work and can be done securely and what the security considerations are is important, because I think, you know, we'll see more of this kind of thing happening.
Agreed.
And so, you know, I don't, you know, I've done something, you know, I've implemented something, well, I guess I didn't write the code, but, you know, architected something that was 1 basically, with some optimizations to protect data. You know, 3A might be the closest. If I was, you know, judging people's comments, 3A might be the one that people might be most willing to sort of move forward. And then, you know, but I don't know, I'd be tempted to, I would encourage you to, you know, pick one and see about, can we move that forward from an industry perspective? You know, even if these other ones are viable in other circumstances.
Got it. Thank you.
So George, thanks a lot. Thanks all the participants of the discussion, and thanks to Kelley for the presentation. I'm quickly turning over to